enjoyed that thoroughly. And good morning, everyone, and happy Sabbath. I want to say I am happy that we have this blessing of technology. Amen. Like, if you look at the history of God's church, the history of the church was always tied to technology. We had the technology of writing, and that became the cornerstone of the Hebrew religion. Then we had the technology of the printing press, and the Bible became the foundation of the church. Now we have the technology of Zoom. Who knows what will be next? But we know that God has given us all these blessings so we can use them for good. Obviously, the enemy is not sleeping and he will try and pervert everything he can. But I think that as long as we try and use God's blessings for good, everyone will be blessed. So I'm really happy that we can do this, even though the whole world is in lockdown and everything is working against us. We can still be blessed and be together. So thank God for this. Um, as Elder Alex said in his introduction, I was born in Serbia. My family is from Macedonia, and we lived in both countries. And if you know anything about the history of that region, you will know that and if you know anything about my age, you will know that for the first maybe 11, 12 years of my life, I was always living in a country that was either currently at war or preparing for a war or recovering from a recent war. And those wars were civil wars. Um, there weren't wars between opposing countries. There were wars within one country because that whole region used to be one
Hi
country
guys, do you ever
until the
think of
war
starting a
started. So there were
YouTube
wars
channel,
between
but
fellow
don't?
citizens. And many times in history books and in the media, especially back home, we would talk about these wars as wars between brothers. Wars between brothers. And I think that's an important image to think about today. Wars between brothers. And I remember when I was about 11 years old, we were living in Macedonia at the time. And there was a campaign that was launched by an NGO, and this campaign was the mission, the goal of this campaign was to improve, if possible, to improve the ethnic relations between different ethnicities in Macedonia. At the time, the tension was really high between the Macedonian people and the Albanian people living in the same country. Tensions were really high, and they were on the brink of a civil war. And then this campaign was launched, and the campaign consisted of a series of images, series of drawings made by children, um, and then a series of quotes by children. And the topics that these drawings and quotes were covering had to do with unity, oneness, wholeness, etc. And one of the most famous ones actually became the kind of the most recognizable drawing and the most recognizable quote of this campaign was this drawing of a peacock, a very childish drawing of a peacock, um, which was also one of the kind of national symbols in Macedonia. There is a particular mosaic of a peacock found in a very old church, and that peacock is found on money, on coins, on printed money, on different coats of arms, etc. So this child tries to draw this peacock, and then the quote on top of that was saying "Celo e koga ima se," which in Macedonian means whole is when it has everything, or a thing is whole when it has everything. It was a very childish way of defining what does it mean to be whole. What does wholeness mean? A thing is whole when it has everything. Unfortunately, this campaign did not prevent the outbreak of a civil war, but fortunately, that war was the least deadly of them all, and it was the last one in the region. But a thing is whole when it has everything. A friend of mine recently told me, he said, if I told you a good enough story, a strong enough story, I could make you do anything. I could make anyone do anything. As a matter of fact, I can even make you kill your own wife. And that was just before my first anniversary. And I wanted to disagree with him. I wanted to say, nah, nothing can make me do that. I love my wife. But then I remembered growing up in the very close proximity to war. And I remembered all these wars being fueled by toxic and damaging stories, damaging narratives. And then I realized that I actually have to agree with him. You see, what he knew, what he recognized is the power of stories to move people. He himself is a master storyteller. He is a writer, this friend of mine, and he understands the power of stories. And Jesus as well was a master storyteller, and he understood the power of stories. And if you think about it, Jesus believed in stories so much that most of what he did, most of his ministry on earth consisted of him telling stories. And those were not just any kind of stories, those were particular type of stories called parables. And that word parable is not used very often outside of biblical language. But it's a very simple word. All it means in the Greek, it consists of two bits. The first one is para, which means alongside, beside, next to something. If you think about words like parallel, paramilitary, paranormal, something happening next to something else. And then the second part is the verb boli, which means to throw, to cast, to shoot, to set something. So literally it means to cast the story next to something, to set the story next to something, right? And that something is reality. So a parable is a story that is set next to reality. And unlike other stories, like for example, fables, which have animal characters most of the time, parables, as a rule, as a guideline, they tend to have human characters. And these human characters tend to be fashioned or modeled on something that we would recognize in reality, on real characters living in real human conditions, in embedded in culture and history. And because they were made to be relatable, parables by their definition, by their nature, they lend themselves to multiple interpretations because people relate to them in different ways. But what is important about parables is that, again, as a rule, they always try to draw our attention to something in reality that we are either oblivious to or something that we know, but we don't like to talk about or don't like to think about. And they always have this intention, this, you could say, this agenda, which is to call for change, to call for action. There is this agenda of exhortation in parables. There is a saying, I don't know who said it, but I found it really powerful. And it says, Jesus came to comfort the afflicted, but also to afflict the comfortable. I'll say that again. Jesus came to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. I think that with this view in mind, we need to approach the parables. And with this view in mind, I want us today approach the parable of the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15. Now, the word prodigal, again, is not a very common word that you would use outside of biblical or church language. I have never, in fact, heard the word prodigal outside of church. But what it means, it's a simple word really. All it means is, in the more positive sense, it could mean generous, lavish, extravagant, and in the more negative sense, it could mean wasteful, irresponsible, imprudent, prodigal. And in different translations of the Bible, this story, this parable, is titled differently. The title would sometimes be the prodigal son. Sometimes it would be the prodigal and his brother. Sometimes the lost son, the two brothers, the loving father, the compassionate father, the forgiving father. And all these different titles for the same parable, they are meant to suggest and maybe imply the adopted interpretation of the translator or the editor or whoever put together that particular version of the Bible. So if that is the trend, if the rule is that the title should reflect our theology, then for the purpose of this message, let's call this the story of the prodigal father. And what I want to do, rather than take away or discredit some of the other readings of this parable that we have come across through our Christian lives, through reading the Bible, through our history with the Christian church. All I want to do is just offer another angle that will add to the richness and the value of this parable for us. And this angle is a particular reading, which is an attempt to reconstruct, to try and go back in history and reconstruct how the original audience, the first century Jewish Palestinian audience, would have reacted um, when they first heard this parable. And we will do that by looking at the historical context, by scriptural parallels within the Bible, looking at some rabbinic sources, which, although the rabbinic tradition um, in its written form is younger than the Bible, the actual oral tradition is older than the written word, so it can add some value. And then also looking at the context of the parable within the whole Gospel of Luke. So if we start with that last point, looking at the Gospel as a whole, we note that this parable, the parable of the prodigal father, is preceded by two other parables that have some things in common, because they all three of them talk about some things being lost and then being found. And that is first the parable of the lost sheep, and then the parable of the lost coin. So these three stories, they have some things in common, and it's important to notice that so we can better understand them. So without further ado, let us read the parable of the lost sheep. In Luke chapter 15, I will ask the person who has the first parable to read it to us.
It reads, "Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to him, and the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them. So he told them this parable. Which one of you, having 100 sheep and losing one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? When he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders and rejoices. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that was lost. Just so I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you for that. So one thing that would have been obvious immediately to a first century listener is that this person who had 100 sheep was a relatively wealthy and well-off man. When Jesus said, "Which one of you having 100 sheep?" and if he asked for a show of hands, there probably wouldn't be many hands, because not many people could boast having 100 sheep. This was a considerable number of sheep in first century Palestine. So at the very beginning, this story opens with this image, this idea of wealth, stability, prosperity. And then something happens. Sheep gets lost. Mind you, if we look carefully at what Jesus said, he didn't say that the sheep got lost. He said, "Which one of you having 100 sheep and losing one of them?" The shepherd was the one who lost the sheep. That would have been obvious to a first century listener, because anyone who worked with sheep would know um, that if a sheep goes astray from the flock, that is the responsibility of the shepherd. He should have been the one watching over the sheep, making sure that they're all together. That's why they would sometimes go with other shepherds. That's why they had dogs. That's why they were responsible for the flock being together. So immediately these two ideas, there was wealth, stability, prosperity, um, well-being, and then something went wrong, and it was the shepherd's responsibility. Another thing that they would have noticed is that um, spotting a difference between a flock of 100 sheep and a flock of 99 sheep, just by looking at the flock, would have been virtually impossible. The only way the shepherd could have noticed that one sheep is missing was by counting the sheep. So by being the opposite of prodigal, by being caring, by being careful, by being in well in charge of his dominion, by being a good steward, by being a good shepherd. He was counting his sheep, and that's how he found out that one of them was missing. Right, and then the next thing we know is that the shepherd left everything, went on a rescue mission, and then he found the sheep, and he rejoiced because he found his sheep, and then he went and brought his neighbors, and then the story ends with this image, this idea of communal rejoicing, of communal celebration, people together celebrating. However, what is not said in the story, but is kind of left lingering in the background as a question, probably tainting, this image of joy and celebration just slightly, is the question of the fate of the 99 sheep that were left in the wilderness. The story never tells us whether the shepherd went back to them, whether he found them there, whether they were fine. But a first century listener would have picked up on this, and anyone listening to this story would have told you that a person who leaves 99 sheep in the wilderness to go chase after one will in the end only be left with that one, because he would have lost the 99 in the wilderness. But that question is not answered. The story just leaves it there, perhaps as sort of a foreshadowing of what is to come in the next two stories. So let us look at the second parable, the parable of the lost coin. And if someone can read it for us, please.
I believe that's Raphael. Raphael, you ready?
Alright. Or what woman, having 10 silver coins, if she loses one of them, does she light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? When she's found it, she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, "Rejoice with me, for I found the coin that I'd lost." Just so, I tell you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents.
Thank you. Again, straight away, a listener, the original listener of this parable, would have noticed some parallels with the first story. First thing they would have noticed is this woman sounds relatively wealthy, relatively well off. The 10 silver coins that she had were, in the original text, were the 10 drachmas. Drachma was a currency in Greece for thousands of years until they introduced the euro some years ago. And 10 drachmas in those days, one drachma was roughly about a day's wage, a day's salary. So if we think about today's standards in the UK, if we look at the minimal wage, if we limit this to a minimal wage, one drachma would probably be around 60 something, maybe 70 pounds. That's how much a person would make in an 8-hour workday. So these 10 drachmas, these 10 coins, were probably somewhere around 600 and something, almost 700 pounds, which was a considerable amount to have. This woman wasn't poor by any means. Another hint that she was relatively well off is the idea that nowhere is her husband mentioned, or her children, or anyone else in the house. She was seemingly alone in this house, which suggested that she was probably the owner of the house. So she had dominion over her coins and dominion over her house. And then another idea that supports this is the fact that she has a strong and well-developed social network. She has her own friends. And this is important because in the Greek, the nouns neighbors and friends are in feminine, because in Greek all nouns are gendered. These two are feminine. So she went and she invited her girlfriends and girl neighbors, and then they celebrated together, which means that she had her own set of friends, her own network, her own social network, which means that the story begins again with this image of stability, well-being, relative wealth, and that is something that is paralleled from the first parable. Now, another thing that they would have noticed is that the coin didn't and couldn't, in fact, lose itself. She is the one who lost the coin. The coin didn't hop off and went for a walk and then got lost. She's the one who misplaced the coin, she's responsible for the coin being lost. So again, the same idea, relative well-being, then something goes wrong, and it's the person's responsibility. And again, another parallel. The only way she could have noticed the difference between a bunch of 10 coins and a bunch of 9 coins would be by counting. You could hardly tell the difference between these two numbers of coins just by looking at them. So she was being the opposite of prodigal. She was being prudent. She was being careful with her coins. She was counting them. And that's how she realized that one of them was missing, that she misplaced it. And then she goes on a rescue mission, and then she finds the coin, and she rejoices. Again, this image of celebration, communal people coming together, rejoicing, celebrating. So now that we've seen how the stories work, what the plot line is, what are the main elements, now we are ready, and now the first century listener would have been ready to hear the third parable and understand it properly. So let's read the third parable, the parable which we will call the prodigal father.
Tatenda, are you ready?
Yep, I'm ready.
All right.
Okay. Then Jesus said there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of property that will belong to me." So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country and there he squatted his prophecy and living. When he had spent everything, took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to fields to feed the pigs. He would have gladly have filled himself with the ponds that the pigs were eating. No one gave him anything, but when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare? But here I am, dying for hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like no other hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly bring a rope, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and get the flattened calves and kill it, and let us eat let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field, and when he came and approaching the house, he heard music, dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fat calves because he has got him back safe and sound.' Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have not given me even a young goat so that
that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back who has discovered your property with pros, you killed the flattered calves of him. Then the father said to him, Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate the rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found.
Amen. Thank you for that reading. Thank you for accepting to wrestle with this text for us. We greatly appreciate that. So from the very beginning of this parable, the listener would have had certain expectations. As we already established, there is a plot line, there are a set of rules that function in the first parable and then in the second, and those were the expectations that the listener would have had now approaching the third parable. Not only that, but from the very beginning of the parable, certain expectations were, certain associations were evoked in the listener that were then quickly subverted and flipped on their head. So from the very beginning, the parable says, a man had two sons. Now, anyone in first century Palestine would have been very familiar with stories about a man who had two sons, or stories about two brothers. As a matter of fact, most of Jewish history and their religion is based on and revolves around stories in which a man had two sons or in which there were two brothers. From the very beginning, you had Adam, who had Cain and Abel. You had Abraham, who had Ishmael and Isaac. You had Isaac, who had Esau and Jacob. And then Jacob had 12 sons, but his favorite son, and this is important, he had a favorite son, and his favorite son, Joseph, also had two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And at his deathbed, he adopts those two as children because he gives them equal blessings as his other sons. So he gives his grandsons the same blessing as his sons. So this idea of a man having two sons was known to the Jewish listener. Not only was it known, but they had certain expectations. They knew how these stories function. They knew that the older brother is always a negative character. He's the evil one, while the young one is the hero. He's the protagonist of the story, and he has God's favor, right? So that's the expectation. As soon as Jesus starts with, a man had two sons, they're like, okay, here we go. It's one more of those stories from our culture and from our religion and our history and our past. Except then Jesus flips it on its head, because we're told that the younger one was the one who comes to the father and asks him this ridiculous thing, asks him about his property. And this request, it was inappropriate, but it wasn't unheard of. It was a practice that was well known in the ancient Near East in those times. And we have some ancient Jewish sources, rabbinic and otherwise, who warn against this practice as being a foolish practice that only a foolish father would do, to divide his property between his children before his death. Now, the fact that they had to warn against this practice meant that it was prevalent enough that it required a warning. So it wasn't something that was unheard of, that only happened in this parable. There was precedent for this. People did this, but it wasn't good. It was foolish. And the fact that the son asked this was subversive already, because it was the younger one. It's not expected of the younger one to do something like that. But then what's even more subversive and even more upsetting to the listener is that the fact that the father agrees to this. A father who, at the beginning of the story, we have this idea of wealth being shared. There's an estate. The father is clearly some sort of master. There's this idea of relative well-being, prosperity. He should have known better. He should have been acquainted with Jewish wisdom and should have known that this is foolish. But maybe this hints to something else. Maybe this tells us something about the relationship between the father and his younger son. Maybe this tells us that the father, even though he was complicit in his son's foolishness, even though he granted this ridiculous request, maybe he did it because he had a especially soft spot for the son. Maybe the reason why the son even asked this is because he knew that the father couldn't say no to him. Be that as it may, the father, the text tells us that the father divided his property, and in the Greek, it's very powerful. The word is his life. He divided his life, which tells us that this property was his whole life, his life's achievement, his whole life. He spent his whole life building this, and now he quickly divides it. So the structure of the previous story is still present. There is some sort of stability and well-being. Something goes wrong, and it's the father's responsibility for what went wrong. And then we are at this point when he is now dividing his life. Everything he spent his life building, he is now breaking down. The text tells us that a few days later, the younger son picks up and goes. Those few days are important because those few days influenced their relationship in the family. Those few days would have been extremely stressful. In those few days, the father and the son, and probably some of the servants, everyone involved in this estate, would have been involved in selling things, finding buyers, negotiating prices, selling land, selling property, selling valuables. Would have been involved. All of them would have been involved in making the father's assets more liquid, more portable, more mobile, so that the son can take everything with him. And all of this would have created a lot of talk. This is first century Palestine we're talking about. People lived together and they talked about each other. Everything was known. This would have created incredible amounts of gossip and talk, and this would have damaged the father's reputation significantly, because everyone would have known that the father is complicit in something foolish. Anyways, the son picks up his property. He goes to this distant land, and there he squanders the property, doing what? Being prodigal, being wasteful, being irresponsible. Now, we don't know exactly what he did. The text doesn't tell us, even though the older brother later accuses him of spending his money on prostitutes. And then some commentators would try and reconstruct this to mean, well, he probably spent it on a lifestyle that is associated with paying for prostitutes. So everything that goes with that lifestyle. The text doesn't say. This may be true, it may not be true. The text doesn't say. All we know is that two disasters strike him. Not only did he spend all his money, but then a famine came. And this was his real problem, that there was a famine and he was hungry. And also he had no money. He spent all his money. So now what he had to do is he had to hire himself to someone in that land as a worker. This is also important because I grew up with this image of him being almost a slave, sitting in the mud with the pigs and being broken and brokenhearted. But he was actually employed. He had a job. The word that is used there for himself hiring as a hired worker is the same word that is used for his father's servants who were hired. So he had a job, but he had to work, and this was foreign to him. The text says he would have gladly eaten the pods, but no one was giving him anything. Because he was used to people giving him everything. That's why he was hungry, because he would have gladly eaten whatever, provided that it was given to him for free, that he didn't have to work for it. And then he remembers his father's hired servants. And the text says, when he came to himself, when he came to his senses, he remembers his father's servants. And this is commonly understood as the point of his repentance. However, I'd like to suggest that to the original audience, some other things would have been evident that suggested otherwise. But let's walk through it. He remembers his father's hired servants, and he thinks that they are better off than him, even though they are in the same position as him. They are hired servants, they are working for money. He might have been slightly more insulted and slightly more humiliated than them because he was working with pigs, which is something that as a Jewish person he wouldn't have done religiously and culturally. But he's in the same position. He's a hired worker, he's on minimum wage, he's working. But he thinks that they're better off. Why? Because he's used to there being an abundance in his daddy's house. He is used to certain kind of benefits that came with living in daddy's house. And he assumes that even the workers there have the same benefits because that's daddy's house. Things are different over there. they're not as harsh as here. So he makes a plan. He comes to his senses and he makes a plan, and he says, I will get up and I will go to my father. Now, the moment we see internal monologue, we see a character talking to himself in the Gospel of Luke, that is almost always a sign that this person is up to no good, that this person is plotting, this person is devising some kind of plan, some kind of scheme, because they're talking to themselves internally in their mind. They're making a plan. That's how many other stories in the Gospel of Luke function. And what does he think? What's the plan that he makes? He rehearses a speech, a particular speech, and he says, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you." That's the speech that he rehearses over and over again. He practices this speech, and this speech is almost word for word exactly the same as the speech we find in the book of Exodus. Now, the first century Jews would have picked up on this because the book of Exodus was extremely important. The story of the Exodus was the founding story of their nation and of their religion. And in the book of Exodus, we have the Pharaoh who is talking to Moses and Aaron, responding to the plagues that have overcome his country. And he says, I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you. Almost exactly the same idea. I've sinned against God and against you. But we know from the story that the Pharaoh was not repentant. As a matter of fact, all that the plagues did was harden his heart even further. So, but he just wanted to get out of this situation. He would have said anything to Moses and Aaron just to make to get these plagues to stop. But that phrase, that word, I have sinned against the Lord and against you and before you, is almost the same thing now that the younger son is rehearsing in his head. So the plan is, I will go to my father and I will sound pious, I will sound religious, I will tell him the right words, and then he will restore me to my previous position. I will appeal to his better nature. That's what the plan was. So he gets up, he goes home, and from afar, the father sees him. Now, this is important. The fact that the father saw him from afar tells us that he probably was in the habit of standing and waiting and looking into the distance, trying to see if the son will return. And the text says he was filled with compassion. Now, again, in the Gospel of Luke, this term that he was filled with compassion is important. Alex earlier mentioned one of the instances where this is found in the story of the Good Samaritan. The person is lying on the side of the road. For all intents and purposes, could be considered dead because he was left for dead. And then the Samaritan sees him and he's moved with compassion. Another instance was Jesus, who is passing by a funeral procession. The only son of the widow is dead. They're carrying him to his grave, and he's moved with compassion. In both of these stories, someone observes someone else being either dead or apparently dead, and then they're moved with compassion to restore them back to life. Same thing happens with the father. He sees his son, who for all intents and purposes was dead, and later on he even uses that language, my son was dead, and he wants to return him, restore him back to life. And like I said, because he was in the habit of looking at the son, he already had a plan set in motion. The son gave his speech. The father didn't even respond to the speech. All he did is turn to his servants and started putting his already prepared plan in motion, setting the plan in motion. First thing he says, go and bring the robe, the best robe. The text says in its Greek, the first robe, or the first among the robes, and put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Now, this would have been a clear echo to the original audience, to another story that we mentioned earlier, where there was a robe and a ring involved. And this was a story of Joseph. Joseph, like this son, was also left for dead, literally in the ground, in the pit, and then was restored to life. He was also given the best robe. The father gave him the best coat, the best robe, the first robe. And this caused some collision. This caused some friction, and this damaged the relationship between Joseph and the brothers, which also gives us a hint that maybe the same kind of favoritism with which Jacob treated Joseph might have been present in this prodigal family. Maybe there was something going on that was similar to the story of Joseph. Maybe this kind of treatment was there from before. Be that as it may, the son was also dead, like Joseph was dead. He is now restored. And in Joseph's story, he is restored by being given a ring by Pharaoh, and by Pharaoh putting fine linen on him. So this idea of the ring and the robe is intended to bring this image of restoration, almost resurrection from the dead, being put back in your place, being elevated to a position of authority and power again. And not only that, but the father also says, go to his servants, he says, go and slaughter. Now mind, he go and slaughter the fattened calf. Now this wasn't any fattened calf, it was the fattened calf. It was one of a kind. It was the only one of its kind in the whole estate. The original text says the grain-fed calf, while the other animals, the other calves and cows would eat grass and hay. This one ate grain in order to be exceptionally fat and juicy. This was the best they could come up with, right? And it was only one of a kind. And he says, go and slaughter that one. It's very important, this calf. It comes up in the story further on. This calf was kept for a very special occasion. And in the father's mind, this was the occasion. There will be no occasion like this ever again. And during this whole time, while this is all happening, we know that the older brother is not present. He is out there in the field doing what? Working just like the servants did, like the hired workers did. He's doing what any sensible, responsible, God-fearing and parent-obeying and respecting son would do, which is he was working. He was helping his father. He was aware that the father just lost a massive chunk of his wealth and his property, and he was working with his hands, trying to help his father restore some of that wealth back. So he finished his day's work. He's coming back home, and from a distance, he's still in the field. From a distance, he hears the sound of music and dancing. And in the Greek, it's exceptionally powerful because the word used is, he hears the sound of symphony and dancing. And interestingly, he doesn't immediately conclude that his brother must be back. This is a foreign concept to him. This would never cross his mind that this celebration has anything to do with the return of the brother. Because this, in his mind, would have been an inappropriate reaction to the brother's return. Celebration is not what we should do if the brother is back. So he has to go and he has to ask one of the servants, what in the world is going on? And the servant tells him, well, don't you know? Your brother is back. And your father, among other things, he killed the calf. He killed the one fattened calf, the most special calf. He killed that. That's how important this celebration is. That's how important this occasion was for the son, for the father. But the son was not impressed. And what struck the original audience as exceptionally odd, and what we should find really odd about this story, and what we should have problems with as well, is the fact that when the younger son came back, the father organized clothes for him, rings, shoes, accessories, clothes. He butchered the calf. He organized a feast. He overlooked all the preparations for the feast. The arrival of a whole orchestra, that was the sound of symphony, which means many instruments, a whole orchestra. He started this party. They came to the point where everyone was dancing. And in all this time, it didn't even occur to him to go and seek out the older brother. The brother had no clue that all of this is happening. He didn't even go look for him. He didn't even send one of the messengers. The brother was clueless as to what is going on. A shepherd had 100 sheep. A woman had 10 coins. A man had 2 sons. Spotting a missing sheep from a flock of 100 required some counting. It wouldn't be easy, would require some time and effort and counting. Spotting a missing coin out of 10 would not be easy, would require some effort, intention, and counting. Spotting a missing son out of 2 should really be easy, but it still required some intentionality and some counting. And the father didn't do that. The father didn't count. So while he's celebrating, while he's partying with his friends and the rest of the family and the whole estate and the neighbors, he didn't realize that he had lost a son. Again. And the older brother is outside. He refuses to go in. He is angry. The father realizes what he's done. And now now that he realized that it was his responsibility for this son being lost, he now goes on a rescue mission. He leaves everything. Just like the shepherd that left the 99 sheep, he leaves the celebration, the partying, everything, even the son that came back. He leaves everything. And he goes out to seek out the lost son. And he goes to plead with him, to urge him, to comfort him. But the son is angry. He is hurt, and he wants to express his feelings. And he talks in a language that is borderline disrespectful to his father. He says, "Listen to me now, old man. All these years, I've been working for you like a servant. This is not something new. I didn't start working for you once your younger son left. I've been working for you all these years. Since I was born, I was always obedient to you. I never once disobeyed one word from your mouth. And you've never given me anything, not even a young goat, so I can have a little party and celebrate with my friends. Never. I've had to work hard for everything in my life." And he feels so alienated from the father. He talks about his brother, but he never mentions the relationship between them. He doesn't say my brother. He says, "This son of yours, not my brother, but this son of yours, you gave him everything. You have, in fact, always treated him better. He's always had more privilege than me. You gave him the best robe. You gave him your ring. Hey, man, you gave him your ring after all the shame that he caused us as a family, after the shame he caused you as a father, after he destroyed your reputation in this whole community. You gave him your ring with your seal on it, after he devoured your property. And the Greek says, after he devoured your life with prostitutes nonetheless. And you gave him your ring. And now this whole party, this whole orchestra, this symphony you brought. Man, you even killed the fattened calf for him. But what about me? What about me? You didn't even invite me. You didn't even come looking for me. You didn't even send a messenger to inform me. You forgot you even had me." And the father is now on a rescue mission, as we said. He realizes that the son is lost. Perhaps he realizes that the son was lost long time ago. And he realizes that he needs to do something about this. So he leaves everything behind. And he treads very carefully. He needs to be very careful now what he says. So the first word that comes out of his mouth is translated in many translations as son. But in the Greek, he says child. That is the most endearing thing he can think of at the moment. And he says, "Child, you are always with me. Everything that is mine is yours." I could almost imagine the elder son interrupting and saying, "Well, everything that's left, that is, after this son of yours destroyed most of it." He says, No, but son, everything I have is yours. Nevertheless, when I die, you will be in charge. He already had his inheritance. So everything that you see, everything that's left goes to you. You're the one in charge. You're always with me. And then he tries to mend the broken relationships. He doesn't say this son of mine. He says, your brother. He reminds him that they're still brothers. He says, your brother was dead. He was dead and he has come to life. He was lost and he is now found. And that's why we need to celebrate. And in the Greek, it says the word used there implies that the need for celebration is continuous. He says it remains necessary to celebrate. It is still necessary. It's a continuous necessity to celebrate, to keep celebrating. And he didn't say it, but he probably thought, and now you were also lost, and now you're found. And that's reason more to celebrate. And he's urging him, he's pleading with him. He says, we are still a family. We still can be a family. We can fix this. Please, let's just go inside and be a family. But the story ends there. And we are not told how this is resolved. The story ends with this image of these two men standing in the field in silence, darkness around them, and the sound of symphony and dancing and celebration in the distance. In the Bible, we learn about this idea, this concept of love feasts in the New Testament. The early Christian church, they instituted this practice, regular practice of literal feasts connected to the Lord's Supper, connected to the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. And when they had these feasts, they would celebrate life, resurrection, being lost and being found, being one family in Christ, being one body. They would celebrate the love that they experienced by God and the love that they experienced among each other. And certain Christian traditions, they continue this practice to this day. Every time they come together, they would have a feast. And anytime actually when a group of Christians does come together and worships together, it is a love feast. It is a time when we celebrate God's love for us and his life, death, resurrection for us, and our love for each other. And every time we do this, every time we come together to celebrate, we need to meditate on this parable. We need to think about it very, very deeply. A man had two sons. Cain killed Abel. And at that point, he killed 1/4 of the world's population. But in spite of that, God put a mark of protection on Cain. God made sure that no one will go and seek vengeance against Cain. Will we be able to protect Cain today? Will we put our mark of protection on those who have killed their brothers? A man had two sons, Ishmael and Isaac, and their children have been in conflict ever since. But at their father's funeral, they came together and they reconciled. So can we reconcile with their children, and can their children reconcile as well? A man had two sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob stole Esau's birthright. He stole everything from him. He stole his life, his future. He stole everything from him. And Esau, in return, he swore to kill him. But when they met at Peniel, they reconciled. So can we forgive those who stole our life from us, those who destroyed our life? Can we be reconciled with them? A man had two sons, and we decide what happens next. Yes, there is a need for a celebration, but a thing is whole when it has everything. Before we celebrate, we need to sit down and we need to start counting. It is all too easy in this time when churches are happening online, we're not physically together. It is all too easy not to count someone, not to account for someone. It is all too easy when this world is responding finally to police brutality and when there is unrest all over the world. It is all too easy not to count someone. It is all too easy in this time of increased division and accentuated segregation. It is all too easy not to count someone. And perhaps we are the one who are not counted and not being accounted for. Perhaps someone hasn't been counted in a long time. Perhaps the family relations were long ago broken and remain broken in our physical families and in our spiritual church families. Perhaps there's not even repentance. Perhaps someone is just taking advantage. Perhaps someone is being taken advantage of. Perhaps someone's kindness is being taken for weakness. Perhaps someone is not ready to forgive. Perhaps there's even no apology. But a thing is whole when it has everything. There is a celebration on the way, but everyone needs to be counted and everyone needs to be present. Let us think about that as we continue to celebrate the love of God for us and the love that we have between us. Amen.
Amen.